Round 2 of our Clausewitz seminar. I hope you'll have a chance to read through book 1, which is this week's assignment. Again, our goal is to read the entire book. We're really lucky to have today another distinguished expert on the subject. I won't say more because we have Randy Papadopoulos, the Navy historian, here to give a more formal introduction. If you don't know Randy, he does great work on behalf of the Department of the Navy and happens to be our speaker's first graduate student from back. So they have a long, long history together. So Randy, with that, I'll turn it over to you to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carson. Well, it is a pleasure to introduce not only an illustrious scholar, she's going to blush if I say that, but that's why I can say that way, but also a good friend. Jennie Kiesling, as you saw from her biography that was passed out, has a bachelor's degree from Yale University, a master's from Oxford University, where she got to hear the lectures of Sir Michael, well, he then wasn't Sir Michael Howard, he would have been just Professor Michael Howard at Oxford, talking Clausewitz, and her PhD from Stanford University. Her dissertation at Stanford was turned into a book. The book's title is Arming Against Hitler, France and the Limits of Military Planning. She is also the translator of Admiral Raoul Castex's Strategic Theories, published by the Naval Institute Press, so she does have a foot in the Navy camp too, which should be something that would appeal to some of the people in the room, since I'm Department of the Navy Secretary Historian. Those of you who are familiar with fiction might recognize the authors David Weber or Lois McMaster Bujold, which Jenny and I are both fans of their writing. And finally, I should add one personal note. At the end of the first seminar I took with Jenny when she was my master's advisor at Alabama, she said, "What book would you have wanted to have written from this semester's class?" And I said, "Well, Clausewitz is on war." And she said, "Really? Why would you want to write that book?" And I said, "Because it's so turgid." And I said, "Well, because it's an influential book and it lasts time." And she said, good luck with that." And then I said, "Wait a minute. If I get to write Grant's memoirs, do I get to be Ulysses Grant and have all his winning in battles?" And she said, "Well, that wouldn't be too bad, would it now?" So, without further ado, Jennie Kiesling.
All right, well, thanks, Randy. I'm glad you mentioned that seminar because I wanted actually to begin. I didn't know that Randy was going to introduce me when I wrote this talk, but I want to say that sitting here reminds me of the worst moment in my first year as an instructor, and it just happens Randy was present. Yeah, there were a lot of bad moments, but also the worst moment in my first year was also the first time I discussed Clausewitz with an audience of field grade officers. I was teaching a night school at Maxwell Air Force Base, where students at the Air Command and Staff College were getting a master's from the University of Alabama in their spare time. And I had a 4-hour seminar on the strategy and military thought, which Randy and some others from the University of Alabama joined. We all took the 2-hour drive together, and then we had our 4-hour seminar. And there I was in this room with some majors, fighter pilots, scary people who were slightly older than I was and very much more experienced in the real world, but I wasn't worried because I had read Clausewitz when I was 18 years old at Yale. I'd studied Clausewitz with Sir Michael Howard at Oxford. One of my professors at Stanford was Peter Perret, who definitely thought I was the stupidest graduate student he ever had. But anyway, I knew Clausewitz, and I knew German idealism, I knew about historicism, and I was extremely confident. So, for 2 hours, I talked to those officers and graduate students about the sophistication of Clausewitz philosophy, German idealism, had a lot of Plato in there, and after 2 hours, I sat back and said, "Well, what do you think?" And Major John Morse said, "Jenny, so what?" And I crumpled up into a ball. I hope it wasn't too visible. And I thought really hard. And I said, that's a good question. So what? Okay, why is this important? And I'd like to say that I audibled, came up with a 15-minute explanation for why Clausewitz is important, and walked away from that seminar shaking, I think, thinking, okay, that was really embarrassing. That was unprofessional, that was stupid. The lesson that I learned from that is figure out what your audience wants to know and try to help them with what they need rather than showing off how bright you are. So, what I'm going to do today is try to talk about On War Book 1, minimal references to Plato, idealism, and historicism. I will mention them, but if I do it too much, throw something at me. And if you really think those are good topics, I'm happy to talk about them in the discussion. What I think I want to do today, though, is not talk about Clausewitz so much for the 19th century, but for the 21st century. However, I am going to have to go back to the 19th century a little bit. So if I miss them, I'm not showing off. I do think occasionally the word's important. I want to begin by talking, though, on how not to read on war. First, do not read on war like the American tourist visiting Stratford on Avon. Randy's heard all my jokes, and invited to attend a performance of Hamlet. After the show, her host said, "Wasn't that wonderful?" And she said, "I don't see what all the fuss is about. It's just a string of familiar quotations." And that's how people read on war. People read on war going from one familiar line to the next. War is an extension of policy. War is a remarkable trinity. War has its own grammar, but not its own logic. In strategy, everything is easy. Everything is simple, but the simplest things are very difficult. I can do this for a long time. Tick, 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 tick. And between the familiar quotations, your eyes glaze over. It's like the block quotations in a paper, which you never read. Most of Clausewitz we never read, because we just tick through the familiar quotations, and we feel proud that we've got it, but we don't even think about what they mean. The famous quotations approach to on war is endemic in the military profession. As a visiting professor at the Army War College many years ago, I listened while an instructor informed the Advanced Strategic Arts Seminar. Anybody planning to go there someday? The 12 brightest colonels in the U.S. Army gathered in a seminar room to listen to an instructor tell them that Clausewitz can be boiled down into 3 bumper stickers. By the way, there are actually 4, but he doesn't like the 4th. Bonus points to anyone who gets the 4th. The bumper stickers: war is an extension of policy, trinity of the army, the government, and the people, and fog and friction. I thought this was a really good joke. And then I realized he was serious. He was telling the 12 smartest colonels in the U.S. Army, I think there was a naval officer there too, that that on war could be distilled into 3 bumper stickers. I do, however, want to copyright the title "Bumper Stickers and Fortunes" for my book on the use and abuse of Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. If On War should not be reduced to simple aphorisms, neither should it be treated as a work to be decoded. And apologies here to my very good friend John Samita, who's going to decode Clausewitz for you in a few weeks. By the way, he and I went to high schools about 8 miles apart, and we were about 3 years apart. We have a lot in common. For decades, I have been told that On War is the greatest work of military theory. I have observed and participated in efforts to discover in it the secret formula for victory. If only, people complain, we had a perfect translation of the text, and we had the intelligence to interpret it, the secret of victory would be ours. Aside from begging the question why the Germans, who did not even need a translation, have not found On War a more useful guidebook to strategic success, I intimated in reviewing John Samita's book, Decoding Clausewitz, if Clausewitz had the secret of victory, he surely could have communicated it more clearly. If you're looking to find how will we win the next war in On War, I know you guys are smart, but surely somebody would have found it by now. These are some of the ways not to read On War. Why should you read it? 1, because it's fascinating, and not turgid as I thought. 2, to protect you from people who use their claims to understand Clausewitz to establish intellectual dominance. Beware 3-star generals, 2-star generals, 1-star generals, anybody walking into a room with a copy of On War, giving you a bumper sticker and saying, okay, listen to me on X. It's a way of establishing intellectual supremacy. The best example I ever saw was at the Society for Military History conference in 2004. Interestingly, I was sitting here, Randy was sitting right next to me. Secretary Paul Wolfowitz had browbeaten the organizers of the Society for Military History for the right to address the society about how things were going in Iraq. And I think he thought he would find a sympathetic audience there. And he told us that people get it because they hadn't read Clausewitz's chapter on defensive mountain warfare. And if only they had, it would all be clear. I didn't actually get his point. I was kind of nudging Randy and saying, what? The irony here is that, of course, Wolfowitz was probably talking to the group of people in America most likely to have read Clausewitz on defensive mountain warfare and most likely to shake their heads and say, what? If any speaker, not to exclude general officers, begins with a bumper sticker from On War, beware snake oil. So, how to protect yourself from purveyors of snake oil. First, read the whole text. And I am delighted, I am thrilled to know that you're going to read the whole text. Not just the bumper stickers. Read the whole thing and ask yourself, why are some chapters important and not other chapters important, rather than assuming that only the bumper stickers matter and skipping the boring stuff. If Clausewitz has a chapter on how to defend a river crossing, read it. Because to understand Clausewitz, we have to understand that he's written a whole book. Figure out what's important to him. Why does he think river crossings are important? And if they're completely irrelevant, ask why we think any part of his book is relevant. I'm saying it's not. I'm just saying read the whole book and think about it. Also, read the text with Clausewitz's biography, the context in which he wrote in mind. As a young officer, and he became an officer at the age of 12, so he had lots of time to study. He was in combat at 13. He immersed himself in the study of history, psychology, contemporary political and military events. Of these disciplines, the one he took most seriously was history, and he really studied history. And by history, I don't just mean the past. I mean what was going on as he lived. He wouldn't have distinguished the past from the present in terms of using events to understand the world. He viewed history, that is events, human, as the best tool for understanding human events. History is the best substitute for experience, and thus in the absence of war, the best preparation for military command is the study of history. Note that Clausewitz elevated history over theory. Instead of using history to create theory, he used theory as a stopgap when analyzing events for which the historical record was incomplete. He was not a political scientist. If theory and known history contradicted one another, the answer was to revise the theory, because history contained the truth. The historical analysis for which he is most famous is the 8-page survey of the military history of the world in Book 8, Chapter 3, which is absolutely wonderful. 8 pages explaining that warfare is always shaped by the nature of states and the societies of an epoch. Now, I began by promising not to talk about historicism, but I have to tell you that historicism is a German historical philosophy that says that every historical period is unique and distinctive. That people in Rome think in a particular way, act in a particular way, and we can't go there. Now, Clausewitz believed this. He believed that every historical period is unique and distinctive. Which brings me to my thesis that Clausewitz is living and writing in a distinct historical period, the age of German idealism. I'm not going to mention idealism very often, but it is important. And he, being true to his historicist principles that every age is unique, would be the first to assert that no one can read On War today as he. We just can't, because our intellectual equipment is so completely different. So the rest of this title is called How Would Clausewitz Read On War? If Clausewitz were alive today, and faced with his own text, what would he do? First, he would warn us about the problems of idealism. He would say, especially book one, the book you've read for today, is impossible for a person in the 20th century.
Well, you define that term for people because it has a counterintuitive meaning.
Yes, it does.
Philosophically,
I know.
How we use it.
I know, and I actually had a whole section doing that, and I practiced a version of this talk 2 days ago at West Point on my buddies, and as soon as I mentioned idealism, it glazed over. But thank you, you've invited me to where I wanted to go. Okay, idealism, as I'm actually to say, but very briefly, idealism is a philosophy that says that ideas are more real than things. And that is distinctly counterintuitive. Plato said that this desk is less real than an ideal form of the desk somewhere in the space of the forms. Because this desk is subject to change. It will deteriorate over time. It is not a perfect desk. And this desk, I mean, you could imagine a lot of things that are like this. I called it a desk. It's actually a table. Desks and tables, well, they're not easily distinguished because in the real world, there are lots of variations. I have a stand-up desk. So is a stand-up desk a desk or is it something else? Well, Plato would say that in the world of the forms, there is an idea of the desk, which has the essence of deskness. And to know whether this is a desk or a table, you consult the form of deskness and the form of tableness. This may sound idiotic, but if you're talking about goodness or virtue or courage, to know whether an act is courageous, you don't want to look at a lot of courageous acts, some of which are foolhardy and some of which are just stupid. You want to get to an ideal of courage. By the way, there is a Platonic idea of tankiness, in my view, which makes armor officers unable to understand French defense policy in the 1930s. But that's my other book. So, thank you so much. This really helped me. Because Clausewitz thinks, when he says in Book 1, Chapter 1, war is absolute violence. What he's saying is, in Plato's world, war is absolute violence. The essence of war is absolute violence. And then he gives reasons why in the real world it doesn't approach absolute violence. Absolute violence is a philosophical construct. However, 21st century readers say absolute war is pure violence. Thus, the war should be violent, because ideal war, perfect war, is pure violence. And if a war is less than pure violence, it's not war. Well, that's what he seems to be saying. And so we have people who think that war ought to be violent, rather than saying this is a way of thinking in the 19th century that we don't understand. We know that war is a social interaction. By the way, Clausewitz gets very, very intelligent when he talks about war as a human interaction. I think today, Carl, I call him Carl for the 21st century because we're so informal today. The 21st century Clausewitz, reading on war, Carl would say, this is irrelevant. We don't need to talk about whether war is violence or not. We need to think about war as a human interaction. So he would say, read Book 1 as a warning for how hard my book is, but don't think that absolute war is a good thing, or that absolute war is a desirable ideal rather than a Platonic idea. And I have a big trouble at West Point. I've written an article called Total War, Total Nonsense. Because at West Point we teach that total war is better than limited war. And frankly, that appalls me. The other Platonic idea that is really important to think about is, the elements of the Platonic Trinity. This is book 1, chapter 1, so you've read this. Clausewitz says that war is a remarkable trinity of violence, hatred, and enmity. That's one part of the trinity. Clausewitz is never easy. The play of chance and probability, that's 2. I think it's page 98. No, never mind, stop. And 3, and of the element of subordination as an element of policy. That is the Clausewitzian Trinity. Michael Howard, with whom I did take a very, very brilliant seminar on Clausewitz and Corbett back in 1979. He says that this is the most important observation on war. And it is brilliant, in a sense, that war is a trinity of violence, chance, and policy, and that war doesn't go in the direction that you expect because these elements don't conform in a nice pattern, but they're pulling war in different. Clausewitz uses the metaphor of a magnet that's moving around, or the pendulum, 3 magnets, 1 pendulum, and your war is moving in all directions because of the force of policy, the force of chance, the force of violence. Now, this is brilliant, but it doesn't work for us today. It doesn't make sense to talk about these epsilons, violence, policy, and chance, because we're not idealists. We need to be thinking about all of the many elements that cause war, and he's talking about a theory of war, by the way, but cause war plans, cause the process of a war to go in other directions than that nice straight line. Yes, we agree that policy will change, chance events will happen, but there's so many other. What is particularly awkward about this trinity is that Clausewitz posits that reason has a role only in policy, that the people are simply agents of passion, and then that the military forces, which are the realm in which chance and probability operate, are rational nor irrational, but non-rational. Now, this is very philosophical and clever, but I don't think it's at all helpful in the 20th century. And I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but obviously we know that the claim that policy, and by the way, the German word for policy also means politics, so this is a subject for another 4 hours. Policy is not always driven by reason. Some of you will probably guess that whether I was going to be here today depended on a decision made by Congress yesterday, that avoiding political statement was probably not entirely a rational process. A more rational process, I would know whether I was going to be here today. President Johnson, just a few historical examples. Lyndon Johnson's decision in early 1964 to continue John F. Kennedy's Vietnam policy until the Democratic National Convention had considerable political rationality, but is hard to represent as rational state policy. This is because we don't, well, I can't go there. In August 1990, when President George H.W. Bush hesitated to order the boarding of an Iraqi tanker attempting to violate the sanctions promulgated in response to Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher famously exhorted him, "Look, George, this is no time to go wobbly." Did the president acquiesce entirely in response to Thatcher's reasoned argument, or did wobbly strike at his sense of manhood? Did Bill Clinton employ cruise missiles against alleged terrorist targets in the Sudan at the height of the Monica Lewinsky scandal purely on the basis of calculations of national interest, rationality? We could do this forever. History is full of examples of policy being something other than the product of pure reason. And the best example, my favorite, is one that Clausewitz lived through himself. When the French declared war on Austria and Prussia in March of 1792 with no foreign policy objectives at all. They did it because there was infighting in the French government, and it was the only way to, well, let's say it was purely political. Clausewitz cannot see this, though. For him, policy is rational. Most modern readers of On War are so uncomfortable with the idealist version of the Trinity, which is violence, policy, and chance, that they replace the intangible abstractions with a different Trinity: the people, the army, and the government. That's not in On War. Well, it's deeply embedded in a paragraph of On War. That substitution leaves us something easy to grasp and obliterates the sophistication of Clausewitz's argument. Are the army, the people, and the government the only actors in today's world? Where do the economic and industrial elements of society, the religious elements of society, all the other parts of our society fit in? And is the answer to the questions the same for every kind of society? What about the communications media? Where do they fit in this army, government, people model? Does a retired general officer lobbying Congress on behalf of a defense contractor represent the voice of the people, the army, or the state? Countries like theocratic Iran and like China, whose People's Liberation Army has its own private economy, certainly defy the Trinity. Carl with Michael Howard about the importance of the fundamental idea illustrated by the Trinity. Wars are dynamic, they take uncertain courses as policies evolve, public opinion oscillates, and military actions go well or badly. But he would add more magnets to represent the many different actors we now recognize. And they would be human actors, not abstract ideas like violence, policy, and chance. Although idealism renders Book 1, Chapter 1 back for 21st century Carl, he would really like Book 1, Chapter 3 on military genius. Clausewitz had very important things to say about psychology and the mind of the commander. The word genius is a bit anachronistic. We think of geniuses as extraordinary people gifted with preternatural abilities. But Clausewitz described a genius more prosaically as somewhat a highly developed mental aptitude for a particular occupation. Now, aptitude is a prerequisite, but not some enormous amount of genius. You need aptitude, meaning that you need to have certain intellectual and moral qualities, which Clausewitz identifies as intelligence and courage. But genius isn't only innate, it requires development. One becomes a military genius by honing one's judgment, courage, determination, presence of mind, physical toughness. Ultimately, the essential qualities of the military genius are, this is an unpronounceable French word, coup d'oeil, the unpronounceable French expression for the ability to assess situations and make rapid, informed decisions. That's point one. And two, determination, the steadfastness to hold to those decisions regardless of prevailing pressures. Now, I think this chapter may be the most valuable, certainly the most inspirational chapter in On War, because it encourages people to develop certain mental and moral qualities. And Clausewitz would probably remember fondly one nice metaphor he has in this chapter. In noting that war makes exceptional demands on the, Clausewitz had observed that, quote, war is the realm of uncertainty. 3/4 of the factors on which action is based are wrapped in a fog of greater or lesser uncertainty. Fog is the feeling of uncertainty that clouds the brain and makes decisions difficult. Imagine Clausewitz's dismay when he later learned that this useful metaphor, and this is a very compelling metaphor to me because I'm a bike racer and I had bad crashes, like really bad concussion. And I now know what mental fog is like. That this useful metaphor of fog in the mind has been badly distorted by 20th century readers. Careless readers, I'm inclined to call them vandals, have combined the metaphor of fog with the concept of friction introduced in Chapter 7 to produce the bumper sticker, one of the three mentioned above, fog and friction, wrongly attributed to Clausewitz the phrase he never uses, fog of war. I have published an essay, a short essay in Military Review, explaining the importance of this point. Here I will just make two observations. One, the prevalence of the mistake, the ubiquity of the mistake, suggests that few people care whether they're reading On War or the bumper stickers. The other is that this bumper sticker contradicts Clausewitz's intent. He entered fog in the context of the demands placed by war on the intellect of the commander. And he reuses the metaphor later in the chapter in speaking of, quote, this psychological fog produced, quote, in the dreadful presence of suffering and danger, a fog which makes it, quote, so hard to form clear and complete insights. Clausewitz clearly meant fog to represent the moral, mental, and moral and mental pressures impeding a commander's ability to make decisions. Fog of war, however, commonly refers to problems of external information. The 18th century originator of the phrase was clearly thinking of black powder smoke that obscured the battlefield. Today we think of fog of war in terms of lack of intelligence or masses of conflicting information, problems external to the commander. The distinction is because Clausewitz's fog and modern fog of war are problems with wholly different remedies. The modern solution to the fog of war is better information. More satellites and better analysts. These are technical matters in which Karl would take a professional interest, just as he was interested in tactical details in his own day. But his concern was not with technical details, it was fogged minds. The phrase fog of war blinds us to his insistence that military leaders need to develop intellect and character so as to prepare themselves to make and adhere to morally difficult decisions when the survival of their army or their nation may be at stake. And I don't have time to follow Karl's rereading of On War in its entirety, but I also want to touch on the notions and means, which he introduces in Book 2, Chapter 2. You haven't read this yet. I'm just going to give you a warning that there are two little sections called ends and tactics, ends and means and tactics, ends and means and strategy, which modern interpreters have used to deduce a more general theory that the levels of war are connected in an ends-means relationship. Tactics as an as a means to operational success is an end to strategic success, which is a means to policy. And this is really practical, and it's great for teaching cadets that tactics have to serve strategy and strategy serve policy, but it's also anachronistic. I don't think it's the way we need to think about wars today. Incidentally, Clausewitz had never heard of the operational level of war. I remember when it was invented in 1982, because I had already read about operations, and I'm kind of hoping to see it go away, but that's another subject. What Clausewitz would note about this whole ends-means ladder is that we're having trouble today connecting tactical success to strategic success to policy success, and maybe we need to rethink that whole ends-means relationship. Clausewitz tended to think of battles as being something like trials by jury, a contest whose verdict victors and vanquished both tended to acknowledge. Karl would be stunned to see how difficult it is today to enjoy the strategic fruits of tactical victory. Instead of urging us to find a way to shoehorn 21st century facts into 19th century theory, Karl would remind us that history trumps theory and urge us to study recent events. And a brilliant example of a soldier who evaluated his own military experience in Afghanistan using On War as his model and produced a synthesis valuable for the 21st century is the work of Captain Emil Simpson of the Royal Gurkha Rifles, the author of War from the Ground Up, 21st Century Combat as Politics. Simpson rejected the ends-means hierarchy of tactics and strategy in place of a in which strategy seeks to provide the context in which results of combat are to be interpreted. If his formulation, quote, strategy does not merely need to orchestrate tactical actions, the use of force, but also construct the interpretive structure which gives them meaning and links them to the end of policy, if that sounds complicated, surely the notion of interpretive structure is no more confusing than absolute war from On War. Karl, I think, would be proud. So, how would Karl von Clausewitz read On War? How would he want us to read it? Completely, thoroughly, thoughtfully, seeking not bumper stickers, but intellectual and professional growth. Some of On War, like the importance of character, is important for its own sake. Much of it has been superseded by modern developments. But the exercise of reading and understanding On War so as to distinguish between what is relevant today and what is not is a crucial preparation for resisting the blandishments of the sellers of snake oil. I really wanted to call this talk, Don't Read Clausewitz, Listen to Him, not as an advertisement for books on tape, but to reiterate the message that while professional soldiers gained much from studying theory, Clausewitz would even more diligently to study history. And a final footnote, this came to me while I was working out this morning. This is what I've got to thank Secretary Carlson again for this whole idea and say, Clausewitz had time. Clausewitz developed his intellect from the age of 12 until he died. This reminds me of the great Tom Lehrer line, when Mozart was my age, he'd been dead for 3 years. When Clausewitz was my age, he'd been dead for 9 years. But anyway, he had a lot of time to learn, to think. And he had sabbaticals. He had days off. You guys, I think it's amazing that you're here on your lunch hour. But the fact that you have to do it on your lunch hour is a sign of the times. It's a sign of the institutions in which we work. And if you guys could get a week off every couple of months just to read and think, and if you could organize it so your subordinates had the occasional hour off, day off, I think the best message from Clausewitz is take your time. Take your time and just think. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kiesling, as well.